just want a good idea,
Oh,
so
yeah.
you care about the story
Yes.
more than you care about my feelings.
That's right.
And I like that.
So,
Fear is a good place to start because then you're not assuming you know everything.
Every time you start a new project, you go, oh my God, how am I going to crack this one?
Stories, for me, usually come from something that I'm working out myself, emotionally.
People that I've met in real life inspire a character sometimes, or sometimes it's an amalgamation of many people.
I sort of approach it like I imagined a journalist would, an investigative journalist.
People say things or don't say things either because they want to avoid something or because they want something to happen.
In order to be a writer for games, you do have to understand the medium very well.
You got to learn your craft.
You have to be like, great, when your first draft is rubbish.
Don't give up.
Go beyond what you think you can do.
Even in your darkest hours, of which there will be many.
Writing is rewriting, is another thing a very wise person said.
Just kill your baby.
You've got to kill your baby.
Probably Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And just have faith that you can make more babies.
Yeah.
Have sex again.
Yeah.
Have faith you can make more babies. Hello and welcome to BAFTA Guru Live. This session is about storytelling in games. My name is Shella Ramanan. I'm a freelance games journalist. I also write my own games and write video games for some studios on a freelance basis. This session is part of BAFTA's amazing year-round program of learning activities supporting people starting out in their careers across film, game, and television. BAFTA is a charitable organisation which funds incredible programmes such as the Inspiring BAFTA Young Game Designers, which is a competition for 10 to 18-year-olds. It also funds scholarships for people who are studying at postgraduate level. Plus, it has a regular timetable of public games events which happen all year round. Our next big event is the annual lecture, and that is on the 4th of October. And it's with Media Molecule director Siobhan Reddy. Tickets are available now, and you can get those on the BAFTA website. And you can also find out about all the other great events that happen all year round, and that is on BAFTA.org. So we're going to talk about storytelling in games, and first we're going to introduce each of our panelists. And so if we start with you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Caroline Marchal. I am at heart a narrative game designer. I started in games in 2001. I worked at Quantic Dream for a long time. I worked on Fahrenheit, Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and 4 years ago I came here. I worked for Sony for a couple of years, and I've started now my own studio, which makes narrative games, based in London, and it's called Interior Nights.
Okay, and I think we have a video to show us a little bit about you.
Great.
Peggy 18.
Good God, Jody, what's happening?
I don't think I'm gonna make it.
Are you prepared to suffer to save your son? You have 5 minutes to cut off the last section of one of your fingers in front of the camera. If you succeed, you will get your reward.
Ever since I was born, I've been linked to an entity. His name is Aiden, and he's always with me.
We can find a way to protect you.
I found you by the side of the road, in the middle of nowhere. Was there an accident? Did someone try to hurt you?
I'm investigating the case of the origami killer.
He is haunted by visions of drowning bodies. It must have fallen out of his pocket.
I don't want anything to happen to you.
But they know only you know how to deal with what lies beyond the rift.
They've opened a passage to Aiden's world?
Aiden! That's her! That's her! She's getting away!
Because next time, I'll kill everyone.
PS4 for the players.
Wow. Some very impactful storytelling there. And so, on to you, Doug.
So I'm Doug Cockle. I'm an actor, mostly known for that guy up there, Geralt of Rivia. But I've been doing voice-over acting for games since 1999. Lots and lots of different titles, AAAs, indies, and everything in between. So
let's have a look at what you do.
I was lazy. I just sent in a trailer for Witcher.
This world doesn't need a hero. It needs a professional. The Witcher Wild Hunt, May 19th. This world doesn't need a hero.
Still flying. And Florent?
So, hello, my name is Florent Maurin. I've been a journalist for 10 years, and then I decided I wanted to make video games, but as I'm a former journalist, I decided to make reality-inspired video games. So I created my company, The Pixel Hunt, which sounds fancy, but the truth is I have to clean up everybody else's mess. And in last year, we had our first independent video game out, Bury My Love, which is about a Syrian couple, Noor, who is trying to flee from Syria, and Majd, who is staying in Syria and trying to help her to reach her destination safely.
Okay, let's have a look. Really beautiful game. Okay, so this session, we're going to try and take you from inception, so when an idea sort of arrives, right through the sort of development process and what happens by the end when Doug comes in and brings characters to life, and then it goes out to you. So one of the questions that creative people always get is, where do you get your ideas from? Which is an awful question because you're never quite sure. But yeah, if you'd like to give it a go, where does that first nugget come from?
So for me, I watch a lot of TV, a lot of films, but mainly TV, true crime stuff as well. I like true crime documentaries. That's my guilty pleasure, I guess. And also I play a lot of games, especially narrative games. Those games, like especially indie games, because this is where there's loads of innovation. And I'm amazed by how different approaches people have with storytelling, so it's great. But where I get my ideas is usually I start with an interesting gameplay situation, which means I try and find a situation where there's enough space for the players to have, just to make use of their agency and bring the story and the characters in interesting places, and that can, and there's a genre also I like crime and drama, and mixing all these, I'm like, how can I find a setup that works well and allows player to thrive in this story, and also characters, obviously, to get in conflict with each other.
Do you have an example of when a gameplay idea brought out a sort of story?
So I can't talk about what I'm doing right now, sorry. But talking about like an example of, for instance, Heavy Rain, you've got really simple, not simple, but like clear setups of, there are multiple scenes really, you could do that, but you lost your kid in the mall. Okay, what happens? How can you find him? What space do you give players to, like, what's the most logical things you want to do? How do we guide them without doing it too visibly? And also, how do we give them space? How do we bring them in the right state of mind? There's another, well, actually, a really good example is the scene where the detective in Heavy Rain goes to 24/7 and to question the owner, and that doesn't lead him anywhere. But then someone comes in and is trying to rob the 24/7. And depending on what you do, it can end up in very different. So that's like a really good narrative setup with good narrative space. And you're like, okay, here I have a scene, at least. The guy can end up killed, the robber can be arrested, you can convince him to leave, etc. So that's really good space. And everything happens in a small, tiny shop.
What about you, Doug? Where do you get inspiration for building on what you've got in a script? Or...
Well, it's a little different from writing a game, obviously. In terms of character creation, there are a lot of things that inspire what an actor might do in the studio. Concept art I always find really, really helpful. So anybody out there who's developing a game, before you bring actors in, if you can provide them with some concept art in the studio, it's really helpful. It just helps us to kind of get our heads around the world that the character lives in. Doesn't have to be the character itself, but that's very helpful, obviously. But the world that the character lives in.
I'm taking notes on that for my games.
It's for a number of games. I've had concept art, and I've always it's always taken me somewhere I didn't expect. So that's really helpful.
Interesting, Florent.
Yeah, we are sensory machines, and I think we should trust our senses. Like, I make reality-inspired games, so my main source of inspiration is sometimes the news, but sometimes only things that happen to me in real life. Like, for instance, for Bury My Love, it was this article on French newspaper Le Monde. It was exactly what the game is, which is a transcript of a conversation between a young Syrian woman who was leaving the country and her family at home. So she was having a chat with them. And it was both very familiar, very trivial, because they were cracking jokes, they were sending each other emojis and selfies, so very familiar to how I use WhatsApp. And also completely alien to me, because like 5 messages later, they were talking about which smuggler to choose. So a life and death decision. And there was such a tension, is that in that similarity and complete difference with the situation I experience on an everyday basis, that I thought to myself, this must be something very powerful for a game. This must be a very powerful basis for a game. But for instance, for my next project, I've been in a car accident last summer, so not a big deal. Well, the car is a complete wreck, but okay.
You're okay.
My daughter was in the back, and she did not even wake up from her nap. So. But I experienced this thing that lots of people talk about, like I saw all my life flash before my eyes. And this is actually really happening. Like, I thought about 1,000 things in a time of maybe 2 seconds, like 1,000 things that came through my mind. And I thought to myself, this is a human experience that is incredible. And what about trying to convey it in a game? So that's what we are trying to do now. So really, like, just listen to your senses and how your relationship to the world, and try to imagine what it would give if it would be changed into a game.
Yeah, sort of absorbing the things that are around you in the world, sort of, being open to that. So, Caroline, you work in bigger studios that, sort of Florent is at the indie end of the spectrum. So I was wondering how, as a narrative designer, how do you fit into a development team? Who do you speak to most, and how does it work?
Okay, so you speak to literally everyone. Well, at least at Quantic Dream, because we did narrative games, like game designers are central, and the game design script, which is the same thing, roughly, is king. So you just talk to everybody, mainly programmers, because you want the gameplay to be good, and then the people who assemble the game, or are sometimes designers, sometimes they're called game builders. And it depends at which stage you are in the process. But then you go on motion capture sets, for instance, so you'll talk to the actors. And then after that, you'll talk to the sound people to make sure the music is at the right place, or that the ambience is right. So literally, it's like being in a hub, and you speak to everybody, and you've got a stronger relationship depending at which stage of creation you are with this or that department.
Mm-hmm. So you're in a sort of privileged position of being in a big studio that focuses on narrative.
Yes, because it's not always like that.
No. Have you ever had that experience of being brought in late as a writer on a project?
So I wouldn't define myself as a writer.
Okay.
Narrative designer more.
Okay. So it might be worth unpacking that difference. Yeah.
So I'm not as great as this lady with words, but I worry a lot about the player, and I know how to make a story playable. And I know what will work with the player, and the main thing is that you want your story to be unfolding within the player's actions, and that's a very different way of writing for another medium. And I just make sure as a narrative designer and now as a creative director that everything you play is meaningful, and the way you play it and what it creates in the player's mind and heart is exactly on spot. It's not always easy, you sometimes you fail, but that's like the goal. In other studios, like I couldn't speak for a lot of studios, but I've been at Sony, for instance, and it's not that you're it's more that it's not that you're brought in late. It's more that sometimes narrative is not that important, so it's like more about that shooting mechanic and action, so that you naturally have less of a role, but there's always a way of trying to make everything meaningful, so you're trying to influence the process. For writers, though, I think it's very different in big studios. Often they are brought in very late, reading Excel sheets and make these dialogues better. Well, it's a bit late. It's a bit. But it's not always like that. And I think there's now, within big studios, an awareness that story and meaning is important, and that not everything is about, challenge and skills and...
I'm getting the feeling that there is a shift happening in terms of how soon narrative is being considered in the process. What about you, Doug? What stage do you get brought in, and what stage would you like to be brought in?
Two questions really there.
Right, yeah.
The actors usually get brought in towards the end of the process, which is not surprising. So when the script has been written, the narrative has been designed, then that's when they go to the voice actors. I had an interview recently, and suddenly things were coming out of my face that I must have been thinking beforehand, but I really liked this idea when it came out of my face, so I'll share it with you. I think there's Florent, we were just talking, he's done exactly this, so there's a precedent for it. I would love it if I, for example, were brought into the writing and narrative design stages early on. I mean, that involves a whole lot of things, issues around casting and whether a company can afford that, and then those are all things to consider and talk about. But I think that there is, just for example, in the theater, playwrights often work with a group of actors to develop a play. So a similar kind of thing could be built into a game development situation. And I think that there is potentially some really fruitful collaborative work that could come out of a situation like that. So yeah, at the moment actors are, I was going to say they're an afterthought. They're not, and not so much anymore, but they used to be an afterthought. It was something that they had to tack on to the end of the development process. More and more actors are becoming part of the process, and that's a really, really welcome progression in the industry. So yeah, I'd like to see it progress even more so that actors can be more part of the development process earlier on.
So Florent, do you want to explain how you are a paragon?
No, I'm not. But I think that it's definitely important to try to have the person who are going to embody the characters you have to be involved in the process. And we try to do that in the past, and we definitely want to do that even more in the future. Like for my next project, it's probably one of the first things I want to do. I am like in the very, very early stages, and I'm already considering actresses because my main character will be a woman. And I definitely want to not exactly write the script with the person, but her to get involved as soon as possible. We've done that in the past, and we want to do that even more in the future. And I think that what's important when you work on a narrative game is that you can challenge a lot of things. You're not completely slave to how you usually make games. Well, you can be if you decide to follow with the old rules, but sometimes you can also try different things. For instance, in Bury My Love, we tried to have the player feel helpless because the story we wanted to tell was one of helplessness, was one of not being able to take care and to protect someone you really and deeply love because she's like 5,000 kilometers away risking her life. And this meant having game design decisions and also artistic decisions that would be very frustrating for the player, and which is something that you do not usually do when you make games. Normally, the player is the king, and you decide every decision you make as a game designer or a narrative designer or is centered towards the player, and you want them to feel as good and powerful as possible. But if you decide that the narrative is the most important part in your game, you can also challenge that and decide that, no, for once, it's not a game that is about you as a player. It's a game that is about the story it tells and the experience you are going to live. And if that experience implies frustration or helplessness or being angry at the game for being unfair, then you should definitely do that. And I think it's something that is specifically important when you're working on narrative games.
Yeah, that's something we've employed in our game as sort of frustration as a means of telling story. The player frustration, it's interesting. So I was wondering how different is Bury Me My Love, the finished game, to the first early stages of the game?
Well, surprisingly enough, it's not very different from what we imagined. No, actually, it's not very surprising because the article I mentioned about Dana, the Syrian woman, was so strong and powerful that it was my aim as a writer and as a creative director. We were two writers on the game, Pierre Corbinet and I was a creative director. It was my intent to have something that would be close to this experience, but as a game. So that's the case. But we had Dana, the Syrian woman from the article, joining in the team and work as a editorial consultant with us.
right.
So we thought she would have lots of input, and probably things that we would write would not fit her, and she would have us change a lot of things. And it happened. She made us have a lot of changes in the script, but yet the final game, is relatively close to what I imagined in the very beginning, because that's about her experience. So what I imagined was something that was close to her experience, so there's no surprise in the end.
Yeah, yeah. One of the big sort of narrative shifts has been, because we've got open world games and we've got much bigger, richer player experiences, branching narrative has become almost the standard means of storytelling in games. And so I was wondering, how do you decide which choices to give players in your games?
I'll try. That's a big question.
Yeah.
But I'll try to do my best. One thing to consider first is trade-off. Is there a trade-off in the 2 or 3 or 4 options you're offering, which is just a game design principle you must all be aware of, maybe not. But it just means, well, I've got something to win and something to lose in each case. Like one is maybe more risky, but with bigger outputs, or the other one is more safe, but with smaller outcomes. That's just one way of doing it. So that's the first thing, because if there's one obvious option, you obviously don't have a really good balance. And then make sure you offer every logical options in context. So I don't know if it's about a couple arguing about who's going to do the dishes. There's no point, like it wouldn't make sense to offer an option to throw a gun and shoot the other person. It depends on the story you write. No, it depends. It depends. Most of the time, it wouldn't make sense. But you want to offer them what makes sense in the story, in the context of the characters as well. Like if your character is super shy, you won't offer the option to shout, or except if it's a turning point, I don't know, in their characterization. But so you make everything consistent in context. And then the last thing I would say, the last layer, so trade-off, logical, and also emotional. Make sure you appeal to the player's guts and emotions, and not only to their brain, because that's what you do. If you want maximum immersion and engagement, you try to appeal to their heart, which means you make them care for the characters, and then you break their heart into pieces, and they hate you, but they remember the game.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's really a matter of, when you're in the middle of the writing, it comes naturally, almost naturally. There must be some tension here. There's a situation that implies that there's going to be tension, and choices are going to be made, and consequences are going to be faced. And so you should just listen to that instinct that you have as a writer, that it is interesting and important. But also, there are limitations to that. For instance, the script in Bury Me My Love is 110,000 words long, which is quite a lot. It's similar to Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, or one of the Harry Potters. I always forget which one.
Yeah.
The biggest.
No, yeah. Probably one middle-sized, but it's quite big.
A medium Harry Potter.
It is big because we decided we wanted to give the player meaningful choices, but we can't do that like forever, because life is too complicated for us to simulate, really. So we have to keep in mind the fact that we have a scope we have to abide by. And this is also interesting because it makes you be very, very thoughtful about the choices you are going to give to the player. But in Bury Me My Love, we also were able to give lots of choices that did not seem that important. For instance, sometimes you can answer with emojis, and you have a choice of 3 emojis. but we hide it from the player. But depending on which emoji you send, at some points in the story, this can have completely different consequences. And we played with that a lot, hiding direct consequences to the player, and they would never know why they would have ended up in such a bad situation or such a good situation. Still, it's always the same thing. It's always because we wanted them to experience this feeling of helplessness.
Yeah. This kind of leads on to another question I had, which was what makes a good player choice? Because we've all had that player choice where you have to go and make a cup of tea because you just can't. You're just like, ah. So what makes a good player choice? How do these people out here create those kinds of experiences for their players?
Then again, I would say that it's life that teaches you that. You kind of know it in your guts.
Yeah.
That you have to. It's not like one of the main things I try to do when I write games is to have players completely forget about system optimization. I don't want them to think about my games in terms of systems and mechanics. And if I do that, I will have +3 in my ability to do things. I want them to completely forget that. And so that's how you get more meaningful choices. I mean, meaningful narratively, not necessarily meaningful in terms of gameplay, because maybe this decision is not that important in terms of gameplay, and it won't give you this super good advantage. But this is important in terms of gut feeling, because you know that if you were to experience it in real life, you would be like, it would be devastating for you.
If I may, just really quickly, just to tack on to something, and this is mostly as a player, I think, I find that the best choices that I have to make as a player are the ones where there is something at stake. You know that one choice is, that if you have 3 different choices, each choice is going to have a consequence that you cannot come back from. So there's always an element of tension, isn't there? There has to be, otherwise it's not a story. It's just real life in a very boring moment.
Yeah, but I agree with you. Like, if the choice appeals to, at some level, to your personal experience, or if it's about something that happened to a friend, that you experience yourself, and then for me the best choices are the ones that give you insights on yourself. Like, you make that choice, and you're like, it can't be the other one, I'll just pick this one, and you'll be like, oh, it's because I'm like this. And then you realize sometimes, like in Telltale games, you see at the end, the community has chosen completely differently from you, and be like, oh no, how that's crazy.
And they've actually been used in philosophy class in Norway. Like all the classes playing
The Walking Dead?
The Walking Dead, and then they have those tablets, and they put their choice in, and then they discuss why they made this or that decision. This is brilliant, because if it's good enough for you to trigger a very intense conversation with folks who play the game too, it's like the best choices.
This is what makes stories super deep, is that like once you've experienced it, and it's even stronger when it's interactive, in my opinion, because you're part of it, you experience it firsthand. Then you learn stuff about yourself. It just makes you not a different, but more aware person. And I don't see this happening with loads of, well, I'm great at Quake, that's fine, but you don't learn, you don't evolve as a person as when you do that.
And that's why I never understood why people would be angry at Telltale Games, for instance, and say, oh, no matter what the choice you do, you don't have a real impact on the story because the branching narratives are ultimately collapsing back onto one another. That's not the problem. That's not an issue, for me, at least, as a player. Not even as a writer, but the very important thing is the experience. It's how it changes you, not how you change the game. You're not the center. You're there to get the story and be changed, be touched by the story, and that's most important and interesting for me.
I think I think when this frustration comes from, like, if you think you don't have any agency on the story or on the character's relationship, then it's like robbing you from your interactivity in a way. Like, I clicked on this one or this one at the same impact. why am I even clicking? You know, I guess, but I agree with you, the journey is more important. Like if it's efficient, if I've gone through high and lows and cried and laughed and all of that, it's still worth it. But I guess from a gaming culture, like there's this agency thing that's really ingrained.
Yeah.
But
and the sort of the win or the idea of the good ending.
Yeah, exactly.
The bad ending, and the good ending being the winning.
Yes,
ending.
there's a winning ending. Well, which is, I don't know, my favorite ending of a reign is where everyone dies. But it's true. I really love it. It's really
yeah, I know. I know.
But, no, but what you said about helplessness, I think it's like very brave design principle, because I'm not sure you could do that with a AAA game.
No, probably not.
Because then your audience will be, you know, it frustrates. But it's the same thing with movies.
Yeah, probably.
You know.
But then choice is only part of the thing. And I think you saying that the journey is really what's really important. And there's a fantastic game called What Remains of Edith Finch.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some of you have played it. And you could almost say it's not a game, because there's very little choice. In fact, the choices that you do have don't have any real bearing on how the story evolves. So it's more like an interactive graphic novel. But it's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
It is.
It's an absolutely, and you do become involved, and it's so that, you know,
I agree.
Choice can
It's
be very important, but it's not the be all
It's
and
wonderful,
end all.
but these guys don't tell you you're having a choice. They just tell you, walk around my story, you'll discover things. I guess sometimes the problem comes with, here's a choice. Well, it's actually not really a choice.
Yeah, quite upfront.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also, I think that's, we could have a discussion that would last for hours about what games are and what makes a game a game. We won't do that now. But also, I think that if you play What Remains of Edith Finch, and if I play it, probably our experience is very different from one another, because you have your life and I have mine, and I have my life experience and you have yours. And probably I stayed for 20 minutes just looking at the sea because it reminded me of something, and you decided to rush through that part. So you did not have the same experience as I did, and you didn't make the same choices as I did. Even a choice like stand still and watch the ocean is already a choice.
Yeah.
So that's also very important, and that's something I can see that is evolving in how people perceive games. Is that it's not always about me being in control of the system and me choosing something and everything is different, but it's more and more about me having some intimate experience with the game, which is something I'm obviously very happy of.
Yeah, so I was wondering, Doug, what's it like being a voice actor who's trying to create the results of all these branches? You know, like, how does it work when you're given your scenes and, you know, this is path A or path B or,
Well, very helpfully, if there are paths for the player to choose, the actor is usually given some kind of a summary of what those different choices result in, how the story changes, how the character is affected, how the world is affected, things like that. The experience is well, I think I've described it as having to be a little bit like an emotional acrobat, because whereas in a play or a film or a television show or something like that, even though you might be shooting out of sequence or rehearsing out of sequence or whatever it is, there is a linear story to be told. And with games, you could be recording something quite far into the game, and there are several branches that are affected by branches that come before. And this is where it becomes very important as an actor to have a director who is very familiar with how the game starts and evolves and moves through. But again, I go back to, with a game like that, if you can do casting earlier on, then the main actors who are affected by these branches have been, at least to some extent, involved in how that story has evolved and how it evolves in the game. So that familiarity is actually really, really helpful to the actor in terms of how they how they internalize the material and the character's experience. So it probably sounds like I'm trying to sell this idea to everybody. Do this, do this. I am. But it's just another example of how the choice of choices can evolve, and how those kinds of things work.
Yeah, and I suppose also choice. So the players, once the player's gone through one set of choices, particularly with Telltale games because they're episodic, it kind of flavors how rash your decisions become as a player. I found that when I'd played season 1, you get to the end, you're like, oh no, because I chose that, so-and-so died, and this, then this. And so it's really interesting. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how those choices, those little, pinch points in narrative, then can kind of affect how tentative the player becomes with sort of choices going further into the narrative.
Yeah, probably they build their own character as they play, probably. And that's also why I think it's probably best not to replay those kind of games. First reason why is I don't know how people have the time to do that. Like, I don't even have the time to play them once. So,
right.
And second reason is that almost the same thing as reading a book and loving it and putting it away, and later reading it, taking it back and reading it again. And then you are very disappointed because that's nothing like you remembered it. So some games are not replayable. Or maybe if technically they are, they should maybe not be replayed. Like there's 19 different endings in Bury Me My Love, but the best advice I have to give everybody is play it once. Because emotionally, it's draining enough to play it once. And then because it's your journey and you've got a sense of this experience that only happens once in a lifetime, and maybe it's not relevant to play it to get all the endings and all the achievements. It's not relevant in that particular situation. Anyway.
Yeah, because I think if you replay for the sake of seeing the branches you haven't seen, and now you're just not experiencing the story, you're just toying with the game, trying to make sure you've seen everything or succeeded or whatever.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I'd be betraying the choices I made and the character I was originally if I replayed. Let's say Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, I loved them, but I couldn't play it again because then I'd have to kill the other person that I saved. And I just like, I couldn't do that because I've lived through,
But this is what you say is very interesting and important, is that you were a character of the game and you don't want to change it because that's the way you experienced it. And that's a sign of good writing if it allowed you to be involved that way, that much in a game. That's because the game was well written, I guess.
It's a bit like life, really, isn't it? If you play through a game once and you have allowed yourself to become involved in the story and the characters and their lives and everything else, you can't really replay it in the same way that you can't really replay life.
Yeah.
That moment's gone.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that's what makes the storytelling in games so different from any other medium. You do have agency, and the choices you make do have consequences, and that's just like what it's kind of like having a wonderfully safe, horrible playground. You know what I mean? We know that we're not going to be harmed by the events that are unfolding in front of us, but unlike a novel or a film or television, which are all great, you can die. And if you're immersed in this world and you die, and it's really upsetting. So yeah, you can experience things in games that you just can't experience in other mediums.
Yeah, that's the reason why I make reality-inspired games, for instance, because I think that I do not wish anybody here to one day become a migrant, because that's not something you would want to experience in real life. But then playing the game and understanding that, it's not like, put yourself in a migrant's shoes. No, it's not like that. You're not going to be in a migrant's shoes, and that's a good thing. But if you experience this through the game, you have a glimpse of it. You have a feeling of that. And this is what's interesting. This is like building on empathy, for instance, something that helps you a little bit more to understand the situation other people go through. And I think that's the same with every game, even the games that are not directly related to reality. You experience things that change you, and that's what makes them worthy, and that's what makes them part of our culture, and that's important.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was wondering, how different is it for you as an actor, Doug, you've played Geralt in 3 Witcher games now, like how different is that to maybe your other gigs where you'll play one character and maybe never revisit them, building on a character over that length of time?
Well, one of the things that's been so wonderful about being involved in the Witcher series is that it's actually quite rare for actors to be associated with a character for 10, 11, 12 years, whatever it was. So I went on a journey with Geralt, and I've said in various other interviews and things that he started out as unemotional, and then in Witcher 2 he was a little bit more emotional, and then in Witcher 3, by the end, you get to the end of Witcher 3 and Blood and Wine, and he's like a different character. But it kind of reflects life in a way, as we grow older, we understand more about ourselves, our world, everything else. So that's a different experience than I've had with just about anything else, Most of the times as an actor, I go in, and often I know very little about the game. And I'm put in front of a television monitor, and the script comes up on an Excel spreadsheet. I'm shown a picture of the character. The world is described, the situation is described, the game is, some of the mechanics are described, and off we go. And I have to make some very quick choices about how the character responds to stimulus and things like that. So that's a different experience. When I went into Witcher 3, I knew the character. I knew the character very well. And that only increased as we continued to record into the DLCs. So it's a completely different experience. And I think that understanding of that character going in informs my job in the storytelling process. So a depth of understanding of a character allows a depth of performance that isn't achieved as easily or readily if you've just met the character.
Yeah. So I was
I think it's the same with writing. When you start writing your character, you barely know them, and then after some time you're familiar, and sometimes you go back to what you first wrote, and you have to rewrite things because that's not how they would react in this situation. So yeah, that's definitely some good way to have a character that's really deep and believable. It's like you have to come to know them.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that, because there's the saying that 90% of writing is rewriting. So yeah, maybe we could talk about the process of getting a game, the narrative from beginning to like how you polish that, what that process is.
Sure, yeah. So with the one I'm working on at the moment, it's pretty standard, hopefully, for a narrative game. So I've got a writing team, 2 writers. It works a bit like a small crew for a TV show. Like I'm like the showrunner, and we get together in a room for like 2 weeks, and we hash out like the next section of the game, and then they go away. Each of them write different pieces. So we do like outlines, first draft, second draft, third draft, and then we use a test. We put it in the game, very raw, like with almost nothing on screen. Everything's gray, placeholders, gray box. And then we play it, first within the team, and then within real people from the world.
Real people.
Yeah, because we're not real people after a while. Like, we don't we are just so close to the forest, we just see the tree. So we get in front of people just to make sure that they understand what's happening, and that they're at least engaged, and then after that, we assemble. So we make changes here. Most of the time it's about pacing, changing dialogues. Sometimes some sections of the game don't work, you change them. But often you can see on paper with experience, and if you know your genre, like am I doing action, am I doing narrative, puzzle, you know on paper if it works, more or less after a bit of experience. And once the game is assembled and starts looking nice, which is generally quite late, you've got the music and everything, then you use a test again, and then this is where you make sure the emotional impact is right, because they understand the story, that was, but that's the last bit that you need to get right at the end, and this is where you make more changes, but it's usually, again, around pacing and tweaking some dialogue.
Yeah, so for Bury Me My Love, I worked with Pierre Corbinet, and he wrote the main part of the game. And the way he did it is first geographically. He had this map of Europe and different locations that Noor, our main character, was going to have to go through. And he was writing spot after spot, and I was writing some of the spots too. And when we had some sequences that we were relatively happy with, we logged in on WhatsApp, and we pinged Dana, who is now living in Germany, and we had her reread what we wrote. And sometimes she would say, no, it's not right, you have to rewrite that. And it was really interesting, because the example I often talk about is a smuggler sequence. Pierre came to me and he told me, okay, I wrote this sequence where Noor is going to a beach near Izmir in Turkey. And she goes with a smuggler. And I might have been a little bit too far. It might be a little bit over the top. So I'm not completely sure. I've been documenting, but still I'm not completely sure. I read that sequence and I said, okay, it looks fine to me, but let's check it out with Dana. And then she gave us her feedback, and she told us it's not frightening enough. Our smugglers they had guns, they were super aggressive, they hit us, we were walking for 4 hours in the dark with only a small flashlight. And what you wrote compared to that is a joyride. So you should rewrite that completely, and that's what we did. And that was really, really useful for us to have this constant feedback from someone who actually really experienced this situation. Yes, we really had it.
Yeah, this is a really good point that I didn't mention, is that authenticity, like making sure you test your story with players, but also with people who know, like, as Dana, like the full experience, or, you know, people who live in the location your game is actually set in. And also script editors are important.
Yeah.
And that works with material like Bury Me My Love, but how do you do that with like space exploration game or
elf,
fantasy?
for instance?
Yeah, exactly. So how do you how do you
don't know
find
any
that
real life
authenticity?
My friend circle is, really. I think we're going to open it up to the audience now. So if anybody has any questions? Yes, over here in the chat. Well, there's a mic coming towards you right now.
Thank you very much, you guys. I really admire all of your work. Is there, seeing as that you've all worked on games that have really interesting choice involved, is there a favorite situation or choice in those games that you really either enjoyed writing or enjoyed playing? For example, I really like the opening sequence in Fahrenheit when you're in the bathroom. I had to pause the game in the Bloody Baron sequence, and I was really terrified of running through a fence in Bury Me My Love. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys thought.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Sorry, so one of my, I wouldn't narrow it down to a choice, but my favorite sequence, I think, and either in Beyond or Heavy Rain tend to be the low-key ones. So in Heavy Rain, like, my favorite sequence of the whole game is the father and son one. You spend your time with your kid in the evening at home, and you help him through his homework, you cook him dinner or not, you give him chips. And the light goes down, and it just feels like I thought it was like something I've never played before. really relatable and really sad. Really like that one. And in Beyond Two Souls, it's the same, like the CIA scenes. Like, oh, okay. But the really good ones for me are when she's at a party as a teenager, or when she's upset with her surrogate dad and goes to a bar as a teenager again. Because it felt like it captured really well these moments in your life where you want to be popular and you're just a freak in the party and everybody disregards you or hates you, or the other one where you have a role with your parents being young. So these are the ones I like most.
I think in Witcher 3, the choice that I found most difficult was whether to give Ciri over to Emperor Emir or not. I think that was one of those choices, and this is when I played it, not when I recorded it. That was one of those choices where I had to stop and really go, wow, well, what's going to be best for Ciri? And that's a really interesting choice to come up against in a game, you know, that kind of power. You know, I have kids, so any of you who have kids, you know, whether they're yours or not, if you care about them, making decisions that directly affect someone you love, those are the hardest. Those are the most difficult. So that one I think stands out for me as a choice that had to be made that I had to really mull over. But another one that comes to mind in The Witcher is the choice, and hopefully I'm not giving anything away, but the choice whether or not to have a snowball fight with Ciri. And small spoiler alert, the choice you make does have a direct impact on the ending that you get. So, and you can alter that ending still, but it does send you down a particular branch that there's very little coming back from. So, and I knew that when I got there, so I made a particular choice for what I wanted. I knew the endings that were possible. I didn't remember all the choices, though, and I didn't remember all the branches, thankfully, because then I could play the game as a player, not as someone who knew the story. Yeah.
I probably won't be very original, but the ending of the first season of The Walking Dead is a moment that traumatized me so much that even like 3 weeks afterwards, when I was talking about it with friends, I was like on the verge of breaking down crying. I think Sean Vanaman is a genius, and I think that he redefined completely what I thought could be achieved through storytelling in games. And I was a young father at the time, and I was playing the game in an open space, and I've been like a fontaine for 30 minutes, and everybody was very embarrassed because nobody knew what happened to me.
It's like, oh God, he's crying.
And on the side of my work as a game designer and writer, there are a couple of choices in Bury My Love that, as a player, makes me want to punch the game designer in the face because of how unfair they are. But as a game designer, I'm proud, really, I can say that. I am proud to having made a game that is unfair because it's about a situation that is unfair. So I think that's the best way to convey that.
Any other questions?
Hi. Thanks for coming to talk to us today. It's a great opportunity for us to all learn about the industry and what actually goes into making a game. I know this isn't kind of what you, Florent, or what you, Caroline, have kind of made before, but attacking an open world story, as it were. So a thing like God of War, where you have that through line, but you have those side quests as well. How would you kind of attack getting urgency through that story? Because there are obviously going to be points in that story where you want to kind of push the player into making these decisions, but you also want to give them freedom into, doing what they want with the open world that they've got. So a recent example would be Spider-Man as well, where you've got that massive open world, but a very urgent story. So I was wondering how you would kind of attack that and how you, Doug, would kind of convey that through your characterization.
I'm personally a very bad example. When I played Morrowind, there's this thing at the beginning that, oh, it's happening, they are coming, you have to close those doors to Demon Side or whatever the name of it. And I was picking up things and making potions. And so, like, I asked myself the same question, but I'm sorry, I don't have any real answer. I like picking flowers.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I guess GTA does it quite well. And I wouldn't say God of War is pretty open world. It felt like it's roughly corridor-like with some, you know, you can turn left a little bit, but then you brought back. So I don't think they face the same problem as Spider-Man, for instance, where it's like really open. You can go anywhere, and there are markers here and there telling you, well, this is an important mission, or this is the main quest. Which is like, I don't think you can really just make the story good, but if players want to do this, like, you know, water flowers or go and drive for hours, it's also fine because these games are made for that. Just what you need to make sure is that when they come back to the main campaign, they remember what they're doing here and what happened before and why they're here now. But apart from that, I think it's part of the thing, like, to give them breath in between, because some players might want to do just the main, some players might just want to wander forever. And it's fine.
It's one of those dangers, isn't it? If you make a truly open world, then how do you keep the player on the task of the narrative? And you could argue, I mean, I don't know if there's a game that does this, actually. You could make a truly open world and have no narrative, and the narrative is the one you create through how you explore that world. I suppose games like...
Minecraft, maybe?
Yeah, well, yeah, Minecraft. I was gonna, this is going back, this is going to age me. Acheron's Call. Anybody remember Acheron's Call?
Never heard of it. Wasn't born.
We're so young, we don't know.
You know, World of Warcraft kind of things, the massive multiplayer online role-playing game kind of things. They still have narratives attached to them in a sense, because you level up and then you can tackle more challenging quests and things like that. But basically, it's an open world that you explore, and the story is... is in play. But with something like God of War or Witcher or you know, Uncharted is very narrow as well, isn't it? So the more open world you make it and the more choices you give to the player, the harder it is to bring them back to the main quest, if that's what you want them to do. So the question becomes, as a writer or a narrative designer, what do you want the player to experience? I mean, I'm not a narrative designer myself. I'm just, you know, thinking, you know, my experience of different kinds of games and both recording and playing them. So it's a really good question, but it's kind of down to what you want to make, I would think.
We have a question. Oh, there's a mic that's been assigned up there.
Yeah, so my question's more kind of maybe possibly the business side of things of narrative design. It's a twofold question. The first part of the question is the fact that it appears games, best example I give is like Black Ops. Black Ops has kind of completely discarded its storyline, and is that a big of a deal in terms of, as a narrative designer, that other games are starting to kind of push aside the storyline they've put forward within their games? And the second part to it was, do publishers have any influence in terms of like timescale or deadlines in how you tell your stories? Because I remember coming across a story where Destiny 1 was really rushed because it had a deadline to meet, which meant the story they wanted to tell never really got told as well as they wanted it to be.
I can answer the second part of the question. Publishers have control over money.
I like your international symbol for money.
That's the screws being tightened, isn't it? Yeah.
That's the tap, the water coming off. Yeah. So, and I guess to an extent, you could work on the story forever to make it better. So I don't know if they give you, okay, Quantic Dream, working with Sony, we had like freedom. They just came back saying, well, this is a bit too much. You can't show that in Japan because they're really sensitive about this or that, but it's about tiny things. And then Destiny, possibly they focused so much on gameplay that story had to be done and redone and redone, and to eventually come quite late in the process and be squished in. So publishers do always have like, we need to come out at this quarter because financially it makes sense for us, or because time-wise you'll be sandwiched between Red Dead and I don't know, Uncharted. So you have to finish now. So that these are all, I think there are bigger considerations around. It's not just give me time to make my story good. When that said, when you make a narrative game, it's really important. So publishers are generally aware of that. But bigger games like God of War or Destiny, it's not that they're bigger, it's just they're more action-oriented. You've got other considerations. And they're also bigger, because huge teams. But
yeah, I'm not sure it's always the publisher's fault if the narrative part is a little bit deceiving.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe maybe the main part of the team doesn't really care about the narrative, and that's not necessarily a problem. I don't think that every game has to be strong narratively speaking. I think that there has to be game for every taste, and if your focus is on tactical RPG or action or very gameplay centric, then that's probably not a big deal. But there's a very interesting short twine game that you can find on the internet that is called The Writer Will Find Something.
We'll do something.
Will do something.
Yeah, right.
And it's really interesting because it's such a documented insight in what it actually can be sometimes working as a writer in AAA studios. And spoiler, it's not very fun.
Helplessness, was that?
Yeah, definitely. Should make a game.
Any questions? Oh, there's one down in the front row after that.
Yeah. What do you need as a writer who's kind of interested in getting into games? What do you kind of need to kind of do you need a sort of, if you've got script samples of film or TV scripts, is that enough, or do you need something else? And where are the best places to go to kind of try and start a career in writing for games?
So you'd need script samples, preferably in the genre. Well, not preferably, in the genre. I think you need to demonstrate that you love playing and that you've played tons of games in the genre and that you're able to deconstruct them as well and say what worked, what didn't work with the story, maybe how you would have done it differently, and demonstrate an understanding as well of production constraints. Like, on paper, everything is cheap. But adding a location or a character or tons of animation, sometimes you're just like, oh, being aware of having a sense of, well, I'm doing this here because it's really important for the player's experience and for the story, but getting an understanding of how it will impact the production. Broadly, you don't have to be a producer, but like understanding who works on what and how much time and money it costs to do, I don't know, some performance capture, or it depends on what game you're working on, but just to do some drawings. 2D is not cheap as well. It takes time.
And there are also lots of tools that you can find very easily on the internet. I mentioned Twine. There's also Ink, the very nice open source scripting language by Inkle Studios that can help you just experience non-linear storytelling and have it exported as very simple HTML files that you can share to people for them to experience your non-linear story. That's probably also interesting to work a little bit with those specific tools, because you are going to use them, not those tools, but similar tools in your professional life. So
it's a really good point.
Yeah. I'd say the same. Just write some games. It doesn't matter if it's rubbish or if it's short, but just something that demonstrates that you know how to write a game. And so many free tools now that it's really accessible. Anything to that? Nope.
I haven't.
You're just like, oh. And so there was a person, these two people.
So we've been talking about player presence in story, and with the emergence of VR, that's kind of shifting and changing, particularly the cinematic way that stories kind of represented in games has had to change drastically. I suppose I was wondering, do you see that happening for the way that story is constructed as well? Does that excite you, and can you envision where that might go?
I'd love to. It's an interesting medium. I don't think it shakes all the story pillars. You know, it's just a new way of learning storytelling, to tell stories, but it's not massively different. I think gameplay-wise, there are some different things, but okay, the camera doesn't cut, it's 360, it's very powerful, so it's interesting. I don't know what it's going to become. I have no idea. I'd love to, but it's exciting. It's exciting new medium.
Yeah, I also think that it can be so similar to the actual experience of life. That's one of the things I would like to experience is to challenge that. And for instance, having jump cut sequences as experienced through VR must be something that's really interesting, because you're somewhere, you can almost feel it, and suddenly you're somewhere else. This is the closest experience we'll ever have to teleportation. So narratively and from a game design perspective, it's like really interesting.
Yeah.
This is just completely out there.
Are you going for it?
Well, obviously I'm not a designer, so I don't even know if this is possible, but can you imagine what would happen if you combined performance capture with VR? And there's a company down in Cornwall, they're based in Cornwall, and I can't remember exactly what they're called, I can't remember what they're called at all, but they've developed some technology for VR that allows you to move in real time through the VR world without having to walk all the way across the room to travel across the room, but your actions are the same. Don't ask me how it works exactly. I found out about this and I thought that's really cool. So if you can fully immerse yourself, or if you think about the Xbox Kinect or something like that, and you start, some of these technologies, if you bring them together, you could tell stories in a whole different kind of way. And the level of immersion, I mean, can you just imagine a story that makes you puke? Like literally vomit, because what you're experiencing is so visceral that your biology responds. That's coming. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of the technologies meeting up and processing powers and all of those things. But it's going to happen.
All this to make you puke.
I live for the day when a game makes you puke.
Can't wait.
Yeah, I know. Sounds amazing. I think we have one more down here in the front. Hooray, we have a woman asking a question.
Hi, I'm a composer, so my question is about music. And I wondered, at what point in the development of a narrative game do you start working with composers, and how important to you is music as part of the narrative process?
Good question.
So we started working on Bury My Love in November, and we ended like 1 year later. So the production lasted for 1 year, roughly. And I first met the composer in February. So we were still writing the script, we were still doing the drawings, nothing was finished, but I had enough for me to share with them where we were and what we wanted them to experience, what we wanted players to experience. We had a prototype, but the game was unfinished. And actually, he went down such a different path as what I have imagined initially, that I think it impacted the way we wrote the story afterwards. So I'm really glad we did that early on.
Trying to follow your path then. We're like super early in production, and we're in contact with music supervisors, because I'm not qualified to do this. I don't know how, who to select and why, but super important, especially with the kind of, first of all, because we're narrative, but also with the art style we're having. Audio is super important in general, and music to support the narrative. So yes, as early as possible. As soon as we have some concepts to share, a prototype to play, that's where you want to start talking to a composer.
Yeah, with my game, before I forget, we had music pretty much from day one, because music is really important to the game and represents a character who's actually absent. So that is a character, so that was really important. And also, the game is about someone with dementia, so using audio, there's things like audio hallucinations, and using audio as a marker of where the player character is, where her mental state is, has been really important. So I've really enjoyed that, working with a musician right from the beginning as just a core part of the team. Yeah.
And you want them early in the team and also until the very end, until like follow-up implementation and playing the builds and being like, oh, this is not where it should be, or should be playing a different tone or emotion. This is, it should be part of the team.
Do you get to hear the music before you act? Or?
No, almost never. No, but that, again, that would be a really helpful stimulus to have when an actor is recording. So, again, basically, the more of your world, your game's world, that you can share with the actors before they record, the better, or even during. And I know that there are some vocal production companies who are starting to toy with this a little bit. I've seen footage of an actor working in a studio, and the soundscape for the moment that the character is in had already been built. So they were able to play that back for the actor through the headphones, and they were then acting the dialogue with that soundscape around them. So, I mean, that's incredible. One of the, I'm often, sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's really important because something I'm often asked about is the difference between acting for video games and acting for other forms, other mediums. And one of the main differences is that when you're in a vocal booth, you don't have the props, the costumes, the set, the music that's being played under your scene, or whatever, the other actors to interact with. So anything that the developer can give to an actor that already exists can only help enhance their performance in the studio. Performance capture is a little bit different, and often there is more available to the actors. But still, again, the more you can offer, the better that actor is going to be able to tell the story you've hired them to tell.
Okay, that's all we have time for. I just want to thank you all for coming along to support the game events at BAFTA. If you'd like to learn anything else about upcoming events, you can do that on BAFTA.org. Don't forget you can book tickets for the annual games lecture with Media Molecule Director Siobhan Reddy. And then I'd just like you to give a huge hand to our lovely panelists.